YouTube.
Great. Thank you very much for that.
Oh, my pleasure.
I know kind of Chris and I did use YouTube and Zoom, but all this other stuff is beyond my simple abilities, I have to say. So
that makes me feel a lot better. Beyond my
no, this is far beyond my capabilities. And at 7:30, you just let them in, Chris?
That's right. That's right.
Okay, great. Let me just put a question.
That was enough bio, was it?
Sorry.
That was enough bio?
Yes. I don't know the yes, I'll just I'll don't know the biography information so that was perfect. No. It's just good to
Just have a context.
yes.
Give me some context.
Yes.
So we're getting a pretty big waiting room now. I'm going to let them all in.
Why are my glasses glistening too much?
No.
Everybody another 3 or 4 minutes just as a grace period to test any technical problems getting on, just so people can get the talk from the start. So yeah, we will get started around 7:35.
Further 18 are currently logged in to YouTube as well.
Okay, great. So they'll distribute across Zoom and YouTube, I suppose.
That's right. Some people will watch on YouTube.
Great.
So everyone's at home, are they? Or somewhere else?
They're right.
Anywhere they want to be.
Anywhere they.
Dr. Nadia, this is the beauty of online.
Very odd.
They're right where the restrictions say they should be.
All right, so what time is it? Yeah, we'll give it 1 more minute and then we'll make a start. Just everybody, we're just letting people log in case they're having problems, and then we'll make a start and start off with prayer, and then we'll cover some admin for the night. Just give me 1 moment. I'm going to plug my laptop in. Okay. We'll make a start at 7:35. We don't want to keep people waiting. We'll start off with prayer, and then I will commence the talk for the night. O Heavenly King, come with us, Spirit of truth, who art everywhere present and fillest all things, treasurer of good things and giver of life, come and dwell in us and cleanse us of all impurity and save our souls, O good one. Okay, well, welcome everybody. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Father Stephen, if I can speak, from St John the Baptist Cathedral down here in Canberra, where apparently it doesn't know that it's spring and it's, below 5 or something outside. We had snow on Saturday, so that tells you something. But Faith and Wisdom is a talk that we give to our parishioners on generally on a Sunday. Every 5 to 6 weeks we have a talk specifically for families to deal with a range of issues around raising a family in a Christian context, which is becoming harder and harder over time, to be honest. Parents are struggling with different issues and challenges, and they look to the church for guidance and support. And that's what the family edition is all about. Now, just a few admin things before we get started. The Zoom, we're obviously coming through Zoom. Zoom will automatically mute your microphone. Now, that's primarily for the reason so that if everybody's microphones are turned on, the amount of feedback through people's speakers will make it impossible for you to hear the speaker. So we ask you to please keep your microphones on mute throughout the talk. There is a chat function for those of you who I probably don't need to tell you these things this far through COVID, but there is a chat function on Zoom, and so please, if you have a question, put it in Zoom into the chat, and I will be monitoring the chat, and I can then put them to Dr. Nadia. Now, during the talk, Dr. Nadia has said, if you have a question that you really want answered while she's speaking, then just let me know. Otherwise, the format will be Dr. Nadia will speak for 30 to 40 minutes, and then there'll be plenty of opportunity for questions. Tonight's topic is communication within the family. We chose this topic. I had to put a couple of topics to Dr. Nadia, and this is one of those topics where we think we know how to communicate, but communication is a skill. And those who can communicate well have learned the tools behind and the techniques behind communicating, listening, and being able to respond appropriately. And within a family context, it can be hard sometimes to communicate effectively. Sometimes spouses have trouble communicating between one another. Sometimes we have trouble communicating with our children, or even our broader families for that matter. And so communication is one of these topics where even though we think, well, as long as my ears are working and I can speak, I can communicate, there is much to learn in this. So I wanted to just do an introduction for Dr. Nadia, for those who have not had a chance to hear Dr. Nadia speak before. Dr. Nadia Crittenden has a PhD in psychology and is a registered psychologist. For many years, she was a lecturer and senior lecturer in psychology at the University of Wollongong. She's also a trained mediator, and she's filled the role of university mediator for many years, as well as being a member and then the chair of the Human Research Ethics Committee. As a counsellor, she's worked in student counselling as well as with private clients, including families, youth, and the elderly. Dr. Nadia is a practicing Russian Orthodox Christian and is currently at the Cathedral in Sydney. And for 17 years, she was a council member and treasurer of the parish of Wollongong. As I mentioned, she's now living in Strathfield and is retired from the academic life, but she continues to be an active member in both the Stratford and the Wollongong parishes. Dr. Nadia has given many talks over her career at SIESD, parish camps and parish groups. She's very well qualified to be giving this talk. And so I will stop speaking and I'll hand over to Dr. Nadia. And as I mentioned, please utilise the chat. I'll be keeping an eye on it if you've got questions. If you would like to direct a question directly to Dr. Nadia during her talk, just let me know, and then I'll let Dr. Nadia know, and you can unmute your microphone, ask your question, and then turn your microphone back onto mute. Dr. Nadia, firstly, thank you very much for taking your time out on a Monday evening to come and talk to us, and welcome.
Thank you very much. You're very welcome, and thank you for inviting me to give this evening's talk. And thank you also for that introduction, which has probably raised expectations very high. When Father Stephen invited me to speak, I was concerned to find a topic he could find useful, so I asked him to canvass around for specifics. And the topic that emerged was communication in the family, which is a very complex topic and particularly relevant in these COVID times. The problems of misunderstandings and miscommunication are so often very distressing and lead to even more misunderstandings. Often this is because people don't have a clear idea of what's involved in effective communication. Unfortunately, good communication doesn't happen easily. It's more the case that poor communication happens easily, and it's good luck if it turns out to be positive. The problems have long been recognised, and there's been much written and many courses are on the market to help people increase their communication skills. So what I propose to do is to talk first a bit about the general principles of good communication, because they underlie communication in any context. And then I want to relate those to the special conditions of communication in close relationships, and then look at further conditions related to communication in families, between parents, and then between parents and children, drawing also on the context of our Orthodox Christian life. I've drawn on both psychological and spiritual sources as well as my own experience in working with people. So let's start with some general principles of communication. Wherever you look on this topic, you'll find some common principles of effective communication that are mentioned in every account. And the first of these is nearly always listen, learn to listen. And vying for first place is have a goal. Having a goal means knowing and understanding what it is you really want to convey. That is, having a reason for the conversation. The reason may be practical, problem solving, to exchange information, to make plans, or just to connect and have a chat. Easy if clear? Yes, unless it morphs into that quicksand of emotions, grievances, competition, finding meanings through our own lens. Any conversation can turn quickly into an argument that triggers personal issues, whether at home or in the workplace. It can take only one careless word or attitude, or someone being in a stressful space with other issues going on. Anyone who has sat through meetings in the workplace will have experienced these sometimes quite sudden transitions. A good moderator will act smoothly to direct the talk back to the goals of the meeting. If clear goals haven't been set out at the beginning, it's usually a case of endless circular arguments. One academic committee I sat on regularly once had a notice on the door saying, as you went in, leave your egos outside the door. The goal principle holds for everyday, more personal communication, which can even more quickly transition into hostile emotional encounters. In everyday communication, we don't always identify the goal or the reason for speaking. Is it much too structured for everyday exchanges? We take it for granted that the other person understands from the word go. Or we can start a conversation without actually having a clear goal, without knowing what we want to convey. We can speak purely from an emotional trigger, or we can have a hidden agenda. Sometimes a person won't even realise they have a hidden agenda until they find themselves saying things that they never intended to say. The difficult part is this. To have a clear idea of what you want to say and to communicate effectively, you have to know yourself very well, so you can be clear about why you are speaking. You may not need to identify a goal in a formal way, but you need to think through what the goals are, especially with important or sensitive conversations. And you have to be able to identify and understand your emotions and the role that they play in your motives, in your actions, and in your responses. So the goal principle advises that thinking before you speak and being aware of your goal or your motive for a conversation is more likely to lead to effective communication. An effective goal also depends on its being directed to an appropriate audience. Goals, attitudes, and expectations for conversations with work colleagues, for instance, will be very different from goals for speaking with our doctors or our lawyers, our personal friends, our family members, and all of these require very different approaches. We can't just have one communication style. The other communication principle that ties for first place is listening. Listening well is actually an art, and like any art, it requires a lot of perception and practice. Counselling courses spend a lot of time training people to really listen well. There are some very good reasons why listening well is often very hard. Firstly, it doesn't mean just hearing. It means understanding not only what the other party is saying, but also what they are meaning, what they might not be saying. And why is this so hard? Well, there are just so many ways in which we try to communicate, both consciously and unconsciously. We have words, but we also communicate with our silences. Often these other ways of communicating conflict with the words coming out of our mouths. We employ a number of indicative devices to colour our speaking, sending additional messages. Tone of voice, loudness and softness, satirical notes, sarcastic notes, cutting notes, and also sweetness and gentleness. The same words can indicate very different messages when coloured in these ways. A further complication is that all people speak from their own world of meaning. We can have a common language and we may all agree on the basic meaning of the words we use. But added to those common meanings are the personal meanings that we all attach to words. Just a simple word like water will evoke different images and meanings. To someone who has known severe thirst or drought, water will have an added meaning. And very different from someone who's experienced floods or nearly drowned or lost someone to drowning. Our words for emotions are even more fraught because our emotional experience is so very personal. Many people in therapy have great difficulty in believing that anyone else can understand or feel what they're feeling. This can be one of the most isolating experiences we can have, and it becomes vital to the person's mental health to form a connection. On a more ordinary level, husbands and wives can overcome a lot of communication problems if they can learn to understand one another's emotional worlds and to be patient with those. So listening well requires keen observation, attention and interpretation, as well as being able to put aside our personal lens and try to see through the eyes of others. That requires focus and concentration and the will to be genuinely interested in the other person's point of view. I guess we've all experienced conversations where we feel the other person is just waiting for us to finish so they can get on with what they want to say. And many conversations are not so much an exchange as two separate pathways. An interesting analogy is seeing conversations being either at or leading to a crossroads where we can meet or running parallel, and parallel lines never meet. Listening also involves being willing to go where the conversation takes you, rather than trying to force it to an outcome that you want. A conversation that attempts to push or manipulate someone towards an outcome that you want clearly shows a lack of interest in the other person's views, and the goal is only to knock those views aside. I think we've all had conversations of that kind too. If you want to communicate a point of view that you want someone else to adopt, then you need to employ another communication principle, the principle of persuasion. Correctly used, persuasion requires you to have very good reasons, good evidence, and a respect for the other person's counter reasons and evidence. Bulldozing someone with hard argument, authoritarian stance, emotional blackmail, or disregard for any opposition is a short-term victory. The other person may give in for the sake of peace or simply give up trying to argue. You may think you have won, but in fact you won't have changed their thinking, except to incline them to listening less the next time or to avoid communicating at all. By the time many couples seek counselling, for example, they'll have given up listening to one another quite a long time ago. Other general principles of good communication tend to arise out of those two main principles, some of which we've already touched on. Be clear, be organised in your thinking, be aware of your emotional state, and be able to be objective some of the time. So let's now apply these principles to orthodoxy. General principles of effective communication do not conflict with orthodox teachings, but they are essentially ethically neutral. They do not specify any particular values. They're skills. Having a goal for clarity and organisation doesn't specify the nature of the goal. Listening well doesn't specify what you do with the insights and information that you gain. Communicating effectively doesn't specify the nature of the communication. An unethical person can learn to communicate just as effectively as an ethical person. It's up to individuals to add the values that they follow. For Orthodox Christians, acting in accordance with many of our values can be something of an uphill battle. We live in a society that values and encourages competition, which makes us feel winning is important. Yet communication that has winning as the ultimate goal often becomes merely a battle of wills, with all sorts of verbal bricks being thrown around. We live in a society that values material wealth and acquisition, so it's hard not to argue about money and possessions. Hard for spouses and hard for children. We live in a society that values technology to the point of becoming increasingly and almost completely dependent on it in our everyday lives, in the economy, in our education system. How many rational conversations do we have about personal technology use, and how many of them degenerate into arguments? These days, most couples presenting for therapy begin with one of them saying, "You're always on your phone or your computer," and the other person invariably replies, "Well, what about you?" And then it emerges that they're having a lot of trouble controlling their children's use of phone and computers. Sometimes the connection is actually a revelation. We live in a society that values material success, success in our education, our work, our homes, our holidays, our travel. Orthodox life doesn't discount these values, but it does interpret them differently and add serious checks and balances. If competitive goals involve hurting or humiliating others and or exalting oneself, then there is a problem. If the goal in any communication is to win the argument, no matter the cost in hurt and domination, there is a problem. If competition and winning become more important than the welfare of other people, there is a problem. The good use of competition is not in rivalries with others, but in competition with oneself, striving to do one's best, with faith and with God's help. If our use of technology becomes more important than those we love, if it pushes us to ignore one another while in the same room, if it causes distress in others, arguments, takes every bit of spare time and attention, then something is very wrong, no matter how useful the technology may be. As always, it's not the thing itself, but our use of it that becomes good or bad. It's been argued that our phones and computers are in fact means of communication, keeping us in touch with one another much more than before. And this may be true, in fact is true, but the irony is that while we're in touch with the rest of the world, those closest to us often feel isolated and ignored. Our world may be full, but our house feels very empty. If the pursuit of material gain, success, possessions, status govern our lives, then there is a problem. The scriptures give us a clear directive. From St. Mark, what shall it profit a man if he gain the whole world but lose his own soul? And from St. Matthew, but seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things, enough food, enough clothing, shelter, will be added unto you. And the Lord adds that it will be lavish. Becoming consciously aware of our values in everyday life changes the way we view communication. And indeed, it could be argued that the reality of effective communication, or good communication, depends on the values or ideals that have always been present in human thought. They're not always present in all civilizations, and those values that are in line with Christian life. The first of these values is respect for truth. Without honesty and truth as a baseline, Talk inevitably, sooner or later, becomes manipulative or meaningless. That can be unintentional and often is, but one of the most frequent complaints between people is that their words are being twisted, their meanings are being added or subtracted, and that one or the other party keeps shifting ground. These are the strategies that are commonly used to win an argument at any cost, often aimed to put others in the wrong to do so. Respect for truth is necessary for good communication, because humans have been given an ability that no other living beings have that we know of. We can recognise lying, and we can choose to lie. I am sympathetic to those who believe some animals can distinguish between honest and dishonest people, but that ability is still a lot more complex in us. We can lie to others, and we can lie to ourselves. This ability is, I think, one of the most difficult obstacles to real communication. Lying to others builds on itself. It needs more lies to sustain the line and leads inevitably to miscommunication. Lying to oneself makes it very difficult to know who is speaking. Is it me or the persona or self-image that I've built with lies to myself? Needless to say, a conversation between someone who's lying to oneself with someone else who's lying to themselves can hardly have any meaning. A very good read on the subject of building false selves is a book called Do You Know Yourself by Archimandrites Simeon Kalagiopoulos. It's a good exploration of why and how people lose touch with themselves and the consequences that follow. A further difficulty is that there are many ways of lying, including lying by omission, half lies, so-called white lies, and lies believed to be the truth. Honesty with oneself and testing the truth of what you believe becomes very necessary for meaningful communication and for our spiritual development. Another essential value is respect for others. Without respect for others, respect for their autonomy, their free will, their boundaries and their uniqueness, it is, I would argue, impossible to have a meaningful relationship. This isn't easy in practice because giving place to others is invariably in competition with giving place to yourself. We all have an instinctive desire to put ourselves first, so much so that we actually consider it a good deed or even a sacrifice to put others first. Don't mistake me, it is a good deed and it is a sacrifice to put others first. But what I'm getting at is that we're the sort of beings who mostly have to make a supreme effort and struggle to do that, and sometimes even pat ourselves on the back for it, as can be noticed when we remind others that it's their turn to put others first. We all notice that someone gets to be first. True respect and care for others requires us to develop the capacity to step back, to try to focus on others rather than ourselves as much as we can, and to recognise that others are as valuable and even more valuable than we are. So good communication recognises when another's viewpoint is as valid as ours, even if we disagree, most especially when the discussion is based on a matter of opinion. Where the truth of the matter is obtainable and there is respect for truth, it's easier. Truth doesn't belong to any one person, it just is. So no one can glorify themselves for either recognising it or stating it, nor can they avoid it. The most essential value is respect for love. The Christian description of love is different from popular secular views. From Corinthians 1, we have the most direct description of love. Love suffers long and is kind. Love does not envy. Love does not parade itself. It's not puffed up. It doesn't behave rudely. It doesn't seek its own. It is not provoked. It thinks no evil. It does not rejoice in iniquity, but rather rejoices in the truth. It bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. And love never fails. The gentleness of love, as well as the power of love, is reflected in these words. There is nothing stronger, but there is also nothing more gentle, more patient, more tolerant, more hopeful, more sweet, or more trusting in God. This kind of love has often been regarded as a weakness. The patient, tolerant, non-judgmental person can be seen as a pushover. The true value of these qualities goes unnoticed because they seem relatively unexciting when compared to love fueled by the passions. That Christian love has a depth that can never be attained by the passions also goes unnoticed most of the time. It is often recognised and valued only when real unbearable trouble comes. But it is something of a revelation just how much it aligns with the conditions of good communication. Patience and kindness aligns with ability to listen. Not seeking your own aligns with respecting another's viewpoint. Not being rude, assuming the best, seeking truth, all align with fruitful communication that leads somewhere. While we can only try to understand love, to seek love makes it possible to find a level of communication that burns away all the misunderstandings, communications, confusion, fear, desire to win, focus on self, and desire for power over others. There are many references to love in the four Gospels, many from the words of Jesus himself, and they all enrich the meaning of the description in the Corinthians. The Orthodox Study Bible also contains extra notes in Corinthians and throughout the Gospels. Special problems related to communication within marriage and families. The conditions of marriage present some very special obstacles to good communication. One of these obstacles is the matter of boundaries. As I touched on earlier, respecting boundaries is a sign of respect for the person. However, with the best will in the world, many married people enter the relationship with the idea that all boundaries can be, or even must be, taken down. In Orthodox Christian marriage, you are indeed counted as one flesh. This is powerful intimacy and would seem to require no boundaries, and yet viewed in another way, boundaries become even more important. Take an orchestra, for instance. When the players come together, they form one organism, producing one overall sound. But each instrument has its place and its boundaries. Take away the boundaries and you get a chaos of sounds. But the boundaries have to be very carefully worked out and put in place to produce the right sound. As a solo artist, each player would have their own boundaries with no other demands. But as part of a group or even part of a duo, these solo boundaries have to be reworked. Not thrown out or ignored, but reworked to produce the best and most harmonious sound. Or take two dancers. One dancer alone can follow their own choreography, but partners need to rework the choreography to succeed as a team. So too with married couples. They need to rework their boundaries to produce the best environment for themselves and later for their children. One set of boundaries that are often thrown out the window is good manners or courtesy. Many people have commented that married people often treat their partners as an extension of themselves, so there's no need to be polite. Friends and acquaintances still get the benefits of courtesy, however. Personally, I've always found it very strange that family members will often treat those outside the immediate family with much more consideration and courtesy than one another. Dismissal of boundaries again. It seems counterintuitive somehow that the people closest to you often get the poorer treatment. While we can all accept this as a blessing for our spiritual quest for humility, at one level it still presents us with both the spiritual and practical challenge of creating good lines of communication nonetheless. Yet another problem related to boundaries is that some couples keep the boundaries they had as single people because they don't really think marriage changes their life. They want to keep all the advantages of single life within moral boundaries, but without recognising that they are actually answerable to one another now. One can no longer do what one pleases without consultation or take agreement for granted. Once again, this can be seen as a blessing for spiritual growth, tackling our natural self-absorption, but acknowledgement and acceptance of these new boundaries and the need to fine-tune them can be ignored, giving rise to much misunderstanding and resentment. Arguments can occur without people even realising that what they're really talking about are boundaries. Another problem for married couples is making one another the problem instead of identifying the problem and externalising it. The attitude that we have a problem that we need to sort out together rather than you are the problem goes a long way to being able to communicate effectively. Taking the trouble to sort out differences patiently, giving ground but also keeping the dialogue open, provides a strong structure to a marriage. Conversations about problems are often short-sighted and aim to solve the problems at once. Early recognition that it takes time and ongoing dialogue will avoid the pattern of repetitive, often fruitless, mutual complaining. The advent of children presents a whole raft of more changes, but the principle remains the same, reworking of boundaries to accommodate the changes. I can't think of anything more challenging than communicating with and raising children. Briefly, to communicate with them effectively, you need to understand and enter their world. We can do that because we've been there. They can't enter our world because they haven't yet been there. But to do this, we have to be able to remember as much as possible of how it felt to be a child, how it felt to be growing up, how it felt when we wanted our independence, how it felt when we felt restricted. Children are remarkable at picking up that they're not being understood from a very early age, and they'll lose interest if communication line is not established. St. John Chrysostom emphasises the importance of communicating with children at their own level in his homilies on marriage and family life. These homilies have a great deal of relevance for Christian marriage and family life and would actually deserve to be a topic for discussion on their own. Each stage of development presents its own challenges and difficulties, and once again, these are complex enough to warrant a separate discussion. I think that's probably enough for one talk, but I'd like to close with a few practical suggestions. To communicate well with someone, you both need to be willing to enter the process. So the first thing to establish is whether people are willing to really talk as opposed to seeing it as some sort of duty or a burden that they're obliged to undergo. Timing is important. The topic is important. It's hard to get the timing right and may have to be negotiated, so patience is important. Be honest with yourself and the other person about how important the conversation is to you. Avoid attempting to solve problems when emotions are running high. This is a time to soothe one another. Remember that the person you want to communicate with is someone you do actually care about. Lastly, someone once said to me, "It's never about what it's about," which I found increasingly useful and true. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Nadia. There was a lot to take in there, and
yes, I thought it might be.
No, it was very good. Before I open the floor to questions, just a reminder that you can put your questions in the chat, and or if you would really like to direct the question to Dr. Nadia, you are more than welcome to, but we'll just do it in a coordinated way so we don't have 20 mics switched on at once. And by the way, this is being recorded. It's being streamed as we speak through YouTube. It will go live on the Pokerov YouTube channel, so you'll be able to watch this talk at a later time. Okay, does anyone have any questions for Dr. Nadia? This is a good chance. By the way, I plan to run to, well, at the very maximum, 9 o'clock if we get a lot of questions, or we can finish up a bit earlier. Yeah, not so much.
Yeah, it's...
Well, can I start off with a question? And I think it's one of the most common ones, and it's probably been asked thousands and thousands of times, and probably will be. Communication styles of men and women, because contrary to what society would like to say, men and women are different, and so
they certainly are.
And we have a different, as a husband, I have a particular way of communicating. My wife has a very different way of communicating. Can you touch on that?
There's men and women, different styles of men and women, and then there's individual styles on top of that, so that is quite complicated. However, I think generally speaking, men tend to be much more economical in their communications than women. They are more likely to have a goal set. They are more likely to be able to identify the practical purpose of the conversation. Whereas women, I think, are more emotional in their approach. They want to feel some sense of satisfaction from the conversation. They want to feel some need that is being satisfied with the conversation. As I just said at the end, it's never about what it's about. And I think very often that's something that needs to be identified, that what are the goals of both the people, of the husband and the wife. I think they're different. They expect different things. They want different things from the conversation. So, well, if you can give me, say, an example of a conversation you've had.
I'm thinking. Well, I'm not without disclosing.
Yes.
but quite often, you will get a situation whereby, and I've kind of had to learn this myself. My wife presents me with a problem. Now, I instinctively want to work out how do we fix it, and that's how I approach the conversation and how I'll communicate things. My wife is not necessarily, and it's taking me time to realise, I don't have to pull out the toolbox and okay, let's get this fixed. It's far more about her just wanting to talk.
Yes.
And yes, go ahead.
I was going to say she would want to feel a sense of communication, a sense of closeness, a sense of sharing all this with you, and so on. It's not. As I was saying, a man is usually much more practically focused, and I think, generally speaking, I think it's fair to say that women want to talk more than men want to talk, unless it's about some topic that interests them. But in terms of just personal exchanges, I think generally women are very happy to talk about us, whereas men tend to be more practical in their approach.
So then, Dr. How do we bridge it to find a middle ground that helps the husband and the wife to both feel like they're communicating effectively? What could husbands be doing differently? What could wives be doing differently, and to help the collective cohesion of the marriage?
Well, I think for a start, husbands can actually learn those listening techniques, and not only listen to what their wives are saying, but to be looking at their body language and to be looking at what they're meaning and to be looking for their reasons for wanting to have those conversations. Whether they're reasons of security or whether they're reasons of just wanting to be closer. Relationships aren't static. They're dynamic. They're always changing. People are growing closer together or they're growing further apart. And women, I think, are very sensitive to the feeling of growing further apart. I think they like to feel they're going closer. I don't think men don't want to get. I think they're happy to be close to. I don't think it concerns them as much. And it may be the nurturing part of a woman. It may be the mother part of a woman that seeks these things. But it's also, I think it's also tied up with our spiritual lives, because a part of us always wants to be closer to God. And it's through one another that we learn to love. It's through and with one another. So I think that to learn to listen and to understand what your wife wants and why she wants it, I think would go a long way and would become a lot more interesting, I think, to husbands. Because what she really wants is probably very connected with what you need.
And from the wife's end, what advice could you give?
Well, I think wives need to be very tolerant of males. Males have very distinctive qualities, and a lot of and I think a lot of wives sometimes feel almost as if males don't have a right to be males. They should be more cooperative, or listen more, or do as they're told more, or act more quickly. This one of the most common complaints wives has is that I have to tell my husband 10 times to do something. And I think they ought to be tolerant of the fact that when you start out as a couple, you live in very different worlds. Maybe, 20, 30, 40 years of marriage together and allows those worlds to blend. But it takes time and it takes work, and recognising the differences is having respect for one another.
And I suppose that the point to come out of that is that we can improve our communication.
Absolutely.
Between one another. It just takes work and it takes time, but we do have to be focused on, to working towards that goal.
Patience and kindness, two very powerful things. And the two things that are so easily lost when we're stressed and irritable, and tired and impatient and out of ourselves.
And actually that raises another point, because I think this is quite important, and that is the effect of in communicating tone, especially.
Oh yes.
I once heard somebody say, actually, I think it was when I was going through law school. I think one of my lecturers actually mentioned that the minute one person in a conversation raises their voice even slightly,
Mm-hmm.
the reaction of the other person instinctively is to stop listening.
Absolutely, because you feel attacked.
Mm.
You feel invaded by things like that, and unless of course there's a positive reason. If they raise their tone in excitement or happiness, well, that's another matter. But it's not just the raising of the tone; it's the motive for the raising of the tone that immediately changes the reaction. And I think I touched on that these things colour our speech. Exactly the same phrase can be understood completely differently depending on the tone of voice, the loudness or softness. There are phrases that can sound quite menacing said in a certain tone of voice, but absolutely innocuous. It's the same. It's interesting. It's the same with music. I saw some years ago in some research we were doing. You can have some. There was a little video of a person sitting on a park bench, and one lot of music was quite happy and light, and you thought, oh goodness me, this is it's just a person enjoying the spring sunshine or something. Exactly the same video. With a music underneath it that was ominous and somewhat threatening and building up to something, immediately gave the impression that something awful was going to happen to this person any minute. And I think that our tone of voice is at the kind of the musical background to what we're saying. It can either produce a very positive response or it can produce a response that is actually quite threatening and quite unpleasant.
Thank you, Dr. Ali. Okay. Questions, anybody? I can. Otherwise, this becomes my own personal session for improving my own marriage.
No, we don't want that. I don't know. What is it? Perhaps I can ask a question. Was the talk not relevant, or is it just that you were all thinking?
I think it's such a broad topic
Yes,
that communication goes through,
Yep.
relationships, every part of your relationship is such a massive topic that
That's right.
I was trying to,
Yeah. Well, can you narrow it down to something, just for the sake of this conversation?
Go for it. Yeah.
I think it's. I guess it's more for in terms of family dynamic when you have everything going around your life and it's just crazy and you're trying to communicate, with your kids, with your husband, and everyone's screaming or they're fighting, and you just end up communicating like a crazy woman.
Yes. Yeah. I can relate
all
to
the
that.
time.
Is that? Yeah. Yeah. No, I get that. Look, is that the family dynamic actually, or the conditions in which the families have to live these days? What would you think? Because we have family dynamics now that are surrounded by a society that demands a great deal from parents. There's a tremendous lot going on. There's hardly a minute when you're not doing something for the children, taking them somewhere, organising something. The demands are huge.
Well, I suppose our priorities tend to, I don't know, maybe we have too many priorities, or our priorities are wrong in certain, areas of life, that we should probably bring it more towards the home rather than.
Well, that is a problem, yes, because if you aren't centred in the home, then all your interactions in the home become very fraught. It's because it's not an environment that you are nourishing and actually developing. It's just the place. It's the place you will end up in at the end of the day.
In our situation, well, the kids are homeschooled, so the kids are home 24/7.
Yep.
Husband works at home, so everyone's home 24/7.
Well, we've all got people working at home at the moment. I think that is a huge problem, and it's totally changed everybody's lives. And there's a lot going on because of people working at home. Look, I think that, have you ever sat down and actually worked out what you want in your family, how you want to live, how you would like things to be?
And not specifically, we just go with the waves.
Yeah. Yeah.
We have, but it's sort of then something else comes up and something else
Yep.
comes up.
Yep.
Sort of gets,
Yep.
It's a bit like expectation. I might expect certain things of my wife and she'll expect certain things of me, but it's not our priority.
And it gets swept under the carpet.
And it might get
because
swept.
there's always something.
And there's always something else. But
Yeah.
you know,
Well,
but there's something coming in.
It sounds to me as though you're really letting the outside world intrude a lot into your lives, into your family life. You know, where is you know, is your time taken up more with outside things rather than inside things, or you know, just with the family, or is it? I don't think so.
I'm pretty much housebound.
Yeah, no, well, I didn't mean so much physically as mentally.
Oh, okay. Well, so I guess there's just a lot going on.
It's a bit of everything. Column A, column B, depending on the day.
All right. Yeah, well, that's that'll be right too.
That's probably just general family stuff anyway. It's always...
Yeah. How old are your children?
Our oldest is 9 and the other one's 3.
All right. Okay.
And
So-
she's turning 16 at 3. She's just...
Yes, yeah, they are extraordinary, and of course you're seeing changes that happen minute by minute.
They're very communicative girls.
Yes, yeah. Oh, it's very. Look, it's the worst of it is that when you get so busy and so stressed, you don't fully notice everything, and then later on you think, I should have just focused on watching them rather than doing anything else. But because it's just an amazing time, which you never get back. You never get back. I've always thought that it'd be really nice if in heaven you could get a day back with your children at the age of 3 or 4 or something, just to remember, because it goes so fast and it's so hard to hold on to.
Yeah.
Can you identify a particular communication problem that you have?
But both stubborn.
Ah,
Probably don't give a lot. We just keep going, and it ends up, like you said before, it ends up becoming... It's just everything that you have issues with gets thrown into that conversation.
Yeah, the whole thing, just tossing the lot. Yeah, I think stubbornness is a very funny trait actually, because there's nothing, there's no danger in letting go of something that you want to hold on to. It's not going to run away anywhere. You know, if you stubbornly hold to your own viewpoint, you can actually let go of your viewpoint and adopt the other person. Look at the other person, and your viewpoint isn't going to run away. People seem to have this terrific fear of letting go of something, and yet there's no danger in that at all. In fact, there's a lot of liberation, because you realise that you're entitled to a viewpoint. You can have as many viewpoints as you like, actually, and it's quite fun to actually, take another viewpoint just to see how things look from that viewpoint. It's kind of, if you're stubborn, it's kind of like only ever looking out of one window, instead of walking around the house and seeing the views on all sides. So stubbornness is something you can, think about whether it's really all that helpful. What are you protecting? What are you protecting? With stubbornness. So that's we're thinking about, what are you protecting? That's what it that's what it feels like, stubbornness. You're protecting something and hanging on to it. And you shouldn't have to protect things from one another. It's it's something to maybe think about.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. That was great. Dr. Nadia, so we've got some questions that have come through. One question: How do you harmonise differing memories of the same experience between husband and wife?
Okay, can you give me an example of that? I'm not quite sure what's being referred to.
Well, so I'll have to ask the person who asked the question to provide an example.
Just a simple, non-disclosing example.
Yes. So while we're waiting for that response, another person's asked, can you talk about how to find the personal language of your partner?
Yes, that's a nice tricky one. Well, the first step, I think, is to start talking about what you understand by mean and what meaning you attach to key concepts that are important to you. As a couple, I would imagine that the concept of caring is probably very important. There are other things that are important. Whatever is important to your partner, then you ask them what the words they use in relation to that thing mean for them. Because we all have individual meanings for everything. And to understand the language of your partner, you've got to understand what they mean by what they say. We may all be speaking English, but in fact, it's a miracle that we understand one another at all. And often we go away not having understood one another and thinking we have, which is even more complicated. But that's where I'd start if I wanted to understand the language of another. I'd start asking them what they meant about things that are really important to them. What does it mean to them? And I'd be interested to know if they do start on that adventure as to how it goes, because once you get what things mean, then there are other things you can do to tap into one another's language. Sometimes you meet people who are naturally like that. You can, and it's such a joy to feel you're understood straight away. That there's no barrier there. That you don't have to explain yourself. It's a lovely gift when that happens.
I think maybe in some ways this question touches on there's a very well-known book, 5 Languages of Love, which which puts forward this concept of understanding your partner's love language to be able to communicate more effectively. So it may tie in to possibly that concept.
Yes, I think that's very interesting. That's very interesting theory actually there. I
take it you've read it, Dr. Nadia, and you've in your.
I have skimmed it. It's on my shelf along with a lot of things I have to read at the moment. I've been concentrating a lot on theological readings actually lately, but yes, I've got it. And also another very good book on communicating with very sensitive people. That's also a very interesting read. Because that also involves understanding the language of others in order to be able to speak to them in ways that they can tolerate. Yes, I think there's a little bit of I'm a little bit intrigued, and I'll have to think more about it, about the concept of separate love languages. I mean, that does go back to exactly what a person might mean by the word love. And I think it's very tricky territory when people start to have very individual meanings for love, because then they have very individual expectations, and I think that's very complicated.
So can I ask, have you ever heard of Mark Gangor?
Mark
Gangor.
How do you spell that?
Gangor, I think.
Gangor. No,
Yeah.
I haven't. No, I haven't.
He
What
has
is it?
He has a YouTube. He's a Christian pastor,
Uh-huh.
but
Yeah.
he's about marriage with about communicating men and women, and it's a 4-part series. You can find it on YouTube, but it's really funny, and it really explains the marriage and the communications and how the men and the women think and how each brain works. It's fascinating. It's quite a good.
That sounds good. I'll have a look.
Yeah, I really liked it. We just loved it.
Men have the nothing box, and women can never.
Well, look, it's a topic that cries out for humour, I know, but look, honestly, it's been around for a long, long time, and problems, men and women connecting, is one of those things that I think have been around since the beginning of Adam and Eve. So, I'll have a look anyway. It'll be interesting.
So another question. And I'm not sure, I'll try and see if I can understand it. Can the lack of communication or one-sided communication, not for any malicious reason, cause problems?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, the major problem, of course, is that you gradually start to just inhabit separate worlds altogether. If you don't communicate, then you start to live in your own space, essentially. And that might not be for any malicious reason. It might be simply some people are happier not being connected to other people. I don't think that's a good thing. But there are a lot of people who regard themselves as kind of social hermits. They like their own space, their own company, and they. One of the theories about that is that these people actually have that don't want the stimulation, that their nervous system doesn't want the stimulation. But it certainly causes. It doesn't cause a problem if a person is not in a marriage, but it does cause a problem if someone in the marriage with such a person wants a closer relationship. And I think it's a hard barrier to overcome. Again, you can't force people. It doesn't work. You don't get anything good out of trying to force somebody into a shape or a relationship that they don't really want. I think the saddest thing is when such people do marry and then retreat into themselves. That's very sad because the other person's left really with not too many options.
Yes. Another very good, good question. Can you please give us some tips on how to communicate effectively within the family unit so that children feel safe and welcome to share things going on in their lives, in school, etc.? How can we portray effective communication to young children?
Well, I think first of all the children have to trust their parents. Parents have to not react negatively when their children talk to them. I think children naturally want to talk to their parents, but if the parents either don't listen or react negatively or start to direct them too much. If a child comes home and tells you about something that's happened in the schoolyard and you immediately start to tell them how they should have behaved or how the other people should have behaved, then that will draw the child back. But if you just listen and ask more about it and find out everything they want to say, because with children, what I have found is that often the things they say, it takes a while for the real thing they want to say to come out. They'll say a few things, but then if you question them and let them have their space, I think that's probably the most important thing for children to know. They first of all have a space to speak, and secondly, what they say is listened to and respected. That they're not immediately being told that they should be thinking something else or doing something else or behaving differently. It may be that they do have to behave differently, but that when your children are talking to you about it isn't the time to start directing. You have to think about what they've said and what might need correcting, and then go about it differently at another time. They shouldn't associate talking with their parents with either disciplinary action or criticism, and that way they're going to feel safe telling you anything at all. And I have to say, look, with my own parents, I was incredibly lucky because I could talk to them about anything at all, and they didn't bring in censorship. They didn't say, "Oh, you can't talk about things like that," and that never happened. And as a result, there was nothing that I couldn't speak to them about, and I found that one of the biggest gifts I could have possibly had. There aren't too many people in the world with whom you can tell everything to. If you have a partner that you can, you're very lucky, and if you have parents, you can. And, you can give your children a great gift in allowing them to speak to you openly without fear of criticism. You can certainly have a conversation with them at some time about things that you felt were not acceptable, but it shouldn't be at the point where they're talking to you. It should be a little bit later, so they don't associate the two.
And actually, can I just, following on from that point, how much do children effectively learn how to communicate from us as parents? Is it partly? Is it completely?
I think they learn everything. They copy you. Children imitate their parents. They imitate their parents. In fact, so many adults have said, "Oh my goodness me! I just realised I sounded exactly like my mother, or I sounded exactly like my father." that even they're not even conscious of it, but they will imitate you. And you only see that later. But they learn from you, and they soak it up. They soak it. I mean, how many times have parents been embarrassed, children saying something that the parents didn't even think they understood or heard? Yes, you learn a great deal, and they learn a great deal about communication styles. Children naturally, for example, will shy away from raised voices. But if they're in an environment where everybody has raised voices all the time, soon they join in. But it's not. Firstly, their very first reaction is to shy away because it's a little bit scary. So they learn a great deal. I think that's the biggest responsibility a parent has, and that is to realise that their behaviour is moulding their children. Very much so. While I think of it, the other thing I think that children need for good communication in the family is to be able to participate in family choices. To be asked when things are happening around the house, even when meals are being planned, to be asked what they would like to contribute, what their preferences are, and so on. Not obviously not beyond certain boundaries, but in small ways, and their natural tastes and the things they like and so on are given a little bit of place as well.
Thank you. Going back to a previous question on it said how to harmonise different memories of the same experience between husband and wife. So a little bit more feedback. I'm not sure if it helps. It says more asking in a general sense, as a general principle. It says I see it frequently in couples. They can be charming and can be problematic as well. I'm not sure if that helps.
So couples can be charming and problematic as well. In what context?
And I think it's so coming back to the first part, how to harmonise different memories of the same experience between a husband and wife. So they've gone through something,
okay.
They've experienced it.
Okay, one of them has experienced it as charming, and the other has experienced it as problematic. Is that what they're getting at?
Possibly, I'm not sure.
Yeah. Well, put it this way. I mean, maybe this will be helpful. There are certainly cases where people have gone to, say, a function and have come back with completely different ideas about what happened there, about how it went, for example. And I think that, if the impressions are completely different, then the only real place they can come to is to share those experiences and ask about why it was like that. Why did you find that a wonderful experience and I found it a terrible experience? What are your reasons for finding it wonderful? Tell me about it. And then the other person says, well, what were your reasons for finding it terrible? Tell me about it. And sometimes I think they can actually sort out what happened there. But it needs to be sorted because obviously one person had one set of experiences and the other person had a different set of experiences. So in a way, while they were technically at the same function, they were not having the same experiences at that function. Someone called Pablo Casilla said to, like moving to a different country, one could love it and the other could not. And that would be very much a case of finding out why one loves it and why the other one doesn't. And often it might not be the country, actually. It might be, never about what it's about. It might not be the country. It might be the person who doesn't like it at all has a predisposition not to because they've left people they love behind or something like that. And the person who loves it, it might be because there's an unity there that they couldn't have had elsewhere and things like that. So you really need to unpack those sorts of things.
Another question, from an Orthodox Christian perspective, do you have any guidance on communicating effectively when one partner follows the guidance of their spiritual father and the other does not within a family context?
Yes, that's extremely difficult and causes a lot of problems, particularly if there are children involved, because the children don't know which way to turn. They will, one parent follows these values, the other parent doesn't, and we all know how difficult our spiritual life can be without having someone who doesn't doesn't adhere to the same values. It's all too tempting then to kick over the traces. I think the person who does follow the directions of the spiritual father needs to explain why, and the person who doesn't needs to explain why, and they have to work out whether or not there's a meeting place somewhere there. And also, look, it all comes back to how much do you care about this person and what are you prepared to sacrifice? Because the person who doesn't care about the directive of the spiritual father should at least care about the fact that their partner does. I think that, I mean, you could say the other way, except that I think that spiritually it is better to adhere to the directive of your spiritual father, unless obviously you're being directed to do something clearly wrong, which obviously wouldn't happen too often. It often goes back to a situation of when the couple married, did they both agree to live according to the same spiritual values? And if they did, then what happened to change that agreement? And it's a hard one, and it happens very often, unfortunately.
Yes, that's, and it may be also that you have, that it's possible that they would generally follow the spiritual father, but on a particular issue, they kind of go, well, we're not sure if, I necessarily agree with that, or and the other person says, well, I think that's the correct advice.
That's human. And I think, again, respect for others means that, God doesn't force us. He doesn't force us. I don't think we have the right to force one another. I think a person has to work it out for themselves sometimes, and I don't think there should be hostility because of that. If there's not actual wrongdoing involved, and even then hostility doesn't help, but if there's not actual wrongdoing involved, then I think that we should extend the same tolerance to the people we love as God extends to us.
Yes, and this kind of follows on to the next question that's come up, and that is tips on how to communicate spiritual matters effectively at home when one partner doesn't follow, let's just say they don't follow orthodoxy, and they're from a different Christian denomination, and the other person's keen. Maybe they've just entered into orthodoxy. One of them is making a move toward orthodoxy. The other one may be resistant. Yeah. We discussed this in our first talk on attributes of Christian marriage. It's not uncommon.
It's not uncommon at all, and it's look, I fully understand the zeal of the person who's pulling towards, and I in a sense, if we don't feel something, it's very hard. You don't like to be pulled into it because it's as if you're being pulled into it without really understanding what you're being pulled into. I think one of the best ways is to live by example. If you be interested, if you want to follow the Orthodox rule, to follow them and follow them well, and don't force them on someone else, but let them see who they're living with, and let them see the effect that it has on you, and see where they stand after that, because that is not an easy thing. It is a huge difficulty to actually encourage someone else towards their salvation. That's most of us don't have the skills to do that, and the only thing we can do is live by example and try to be the best we can, so that the other person at least isn't going to perceive a contradiction in what we purport to believe and how we live, because that's the thing that pushes people away a lot. If they actually say, well, look, this is what you say you believe, but look at how you behave, and once they see that contradiction, the whole thing becomes phony. So
yes, and I think the key there is the idea that we can't force our spouses to become what we want them to be. It's we can pray that they would move in a certain direction, but I think it's very hard to force a situation.
It is. I think we need to pray that they're going to become what God wants them to be.
Yes.
I think we muddy the waters when we start saying we want them to be what we want them to be. God already has in mind who we're going to be and who He wants us to be, and I think that's what we pray for, that God will make them who He wants them to be.
Yes. Dr. Nadia, another question. Someone's asking for your particular, well, obviously, but would like your advice on, is there anything specific in the Orthodox faith that you have seen help couples to grow closer instead of further apart? Have you seen, for example, an increase in prayer or church attendance make a significant positive difference in marriage from your experience?
Well, both increase in prayer and going to church for the right reasons, I think, and in the right way obviously help. Well, I rely a great deal on God's intervention. I rely a great deal on the intervention of the saints whom I love. I think that couples, I think, will grow closer together when they learn to love more, and not immediately one another, but to love God more, to appreciate what love actually is. That doesn't. A lot of people think that if they start to appreciate spiritual love, that somehow or other they'll lose that what seems to be much more dynamic human love, but they won't. There's no loss involved at all. You've got to be prepared to let go of something in order to gain it sometimes. You know how it says that if a seed falls into the seed has to fall into the ground and die before it can grow. So I think that if they pursue their love for God, I think they will find their love for each other will grow much, much stronger. Because it is a gift. It's a gift. It's not something, again, that we can force.
Now we're getting close to 9 o'clock. One last point, maybe, and unless anybody's got any burning questions before we finish up. This topic of technology, because we all have smartphones,
Yes.
we all have laptops,
Yep.
we have endless electronic devices, and it seems that these, although they've improved our lives in many ways, it seems like it's fundamentally breaking down the communication within families. And you see this quite often, even young children. They're sitting at home, everybody's got a tablet or an electronic device in front of them. There's no communication going on. I know I stick my 2 children in front of the TV and I'm talking to them. They're not listening at all. They're completely absent. And so, and for us as adults, we're no different really. We're both stuck on a smartphone. We're not communicating.
That's correct.
How much of an impact does this really have? And I suppose, what can we do in a healthy sense? Of course, we're not going to necessarily become technology hermits and cut ourselves off from technology, but what can we do to find the right balance?
Yeah, well, actually, people have been found dead at their computer playing a game, because they haven't eaten for 40 hours or something or other, and just collapsed, which is very frightening. Look, I think this, as my son pointed out to me recently, every time there's been a new major development, telephone, cars, industrial revolution, etc., there's always been a huge surge of interest, and then it's settled down. And well, I think that's a valid point, but I don't see this settling down because we're becoming much too dependent on it. And the other thing is that I don't honestly think that telephones and TVs even are as addictive as the technology that's around now. The thing about television is, and the secret too, if the kids do need to, you want them to watch something, that they do something else at the same time. I've found that if you're watching television and you're doing something with your hands, something else, then it doesn't drag you in the same way. It's there and it's entertaining, but that's all. So kids, I think, should be encouraged to watch TV and do something else. But that's just a personal view. But with the other technology, it fascinates me because the level of it's now becoming a disorder. Technology addiction is now becoming an official disorder, and that in itself is pretty scary as well. But it fascinates me that this sense of absence. Because I was on my laptop at one time, or on my tablet, not a laptop, it's just an iPad, and I'd had a lot of queries about games, because games seem to be a big problem. Kids get really, and the games are social as well. They interact with their friends and so on. So it's very, very hard not to be part of it. It's part of being part of a group, it's socialising, and as well as the game itself. So I started to play a quite innocuous little game, which was Tropical Escape, and it was a thing on an island where you baked cakes and filled out little orders, and little helicopters flew around and little people. There was no violence in it. It wasn't anything. But I found after a while that I'd sit down to play this for 10 minutes. I wanted to understand why people got hooked. And I find that an hour later I was still playing this, that it starts to draw you in. You start to think about it when you're not playing, and then you want to see what's going on, so you go back in and play it some more, and then it began to eat up a tremendous amount of time. And so I thought, I'd better stop this. And lo and behold, I couldn't. I'd stop it for a day or two, but then I'd find myself just, quietly go, just 10 minutes, but then another hour or two goes by, and I suddenly realised just how powerful this was, just how powerful the pull of these things are. And I don't know enough about the technology behind it to know whether it's being somehow manipulated or not, I don't know. But these games and the general use of technology is very, very addictive. I think I said to my sister, my sister is living with me, and I said to her, she said to me, "Do you have to sit there on the iPad?" And I said, "Why? It's not bothering anyone. I'm not making any noise, and I'm here." She says, "No, you're not." She said, "You're not here at all." And that's the bit that made me realise, that in fact when people are on their devices, they have the definite sense that the person's absent. And that's what I was saying about the people earlier, saying that people are connected to the world, to all their friends, but their house is empty. There's no one home because they're all out there. It's as if a part of you, that connective, emotional, mental part of you, leaves and goes out into the internet. So I think it is a very real problem, and I'm just sitting and looking and thinking, where is this going to end? It harms children, I think, and the fact that schools are now adopting computer use for a lot of things. I don't know. It's a big question mark in my mind. I do think that if we're ever going to get on top of this technology and use it wisely, like everything else, it's not the technology that's bad, it's the way we use it. And if we're ever going to use it wisely, then we have to learn how to set very, very firm boundaries around its use, and rather than let it run rampant. The technology is really like an unruly child. We're letting it run rampant. And people are encouraging that. I mean, I'm shocked that our economic system is so dependent on technology. And our banks and things. I mean, the information out there, I'm shocked, because every day we learn more about how easy it is to hack and how easy it is for criminal activity on the internet. And I mean, in my view, that the dark web ought to be enough to get people acting. But in any event, it's a big question and one that worries me a lot.
And you get the regular scenario now where a husband and wife come home from a long day of work, and they'll sit down on the couch at the end of the day, and they're tired. They might have just put the kids to bed.
Yep.
and then they're on the devices.
That's right. Out comes the phone or the iPad. That's right.
Yep.
And then it's time to go to bed.
And there's no communication. We've hardly said a word to each other than, you know.
Isn't it frightening that the being on the device can be more interesting than talking to the person you love? Isn't that scary?
And I suppose it kind of touches on what we discussed in preparing for this talk. You know, Steve Jobs, head of Apple, was reported to not have allowed his children anywhere near technology.
That's right. It's like drug dealers never become users.
So, and we see this too from if you've ever seen that scenario where if you're in a car and you stop at a set of traffic lights, and the car next to you. I've seen this numerous times. The mother or the father is in the driver's seat. The child is in the front seat. Mm-hmm. They've got the earbuds in their ears, and they're completely not communicating at all with the parent. So it's also a question maybe about how soon and how much technology we allow our children to have, because that's not helping communication with our children. That's what we really want as a priority.
It's not helping at all, and they get a lot of information from their internet activities. Information that really should be coming from their parents in a much different way. I think that children. In fact, I've got an 18-month-old granddaughter, and we don't allow her to play with devices at this point, right? But if she happens to grab one at some point, she seems to know exactly what buttons to press and how to bring it to life and so on. It fascinates me because, that mostly kids need to be taught, but and other parents have said the same to me, that they're very, very little kiddies know how to operate them without even being told how to or shown. You have to show them how to, read a clock or wind a clock or do something, but you have to show them with this stuff, go into it, and into it very, very quickly. And that is another scary thing that, you begin to really wonder what sort of Pandora's box we've opened here. I really think that it's a wise idea to not have them around, because that puts the responsibility on parents not to be flashing them in front of the children all the time too. I think there ought to be very strict rules about the use of devices in the home outside of working hours. I think that home life, family time should have no devices. I know one parent who, when the kids come in from school every afternoon, the devices all go into a box, parents and kids, and the box is shut and put away, and it doesn't come out. And I think there's one phone left for emergency phone calls if somebody rings them, but not to use for anything else. So, people are trying to find their own way and trying to navigate their way through all this, and it's a very hard one. Not to mention the fact that kids, even little kids, have extreme tantrums if the devices are taken away from them.
Yes.
And there was that rather horrible news story some time ago where a young man, his father was telling him to get off the computer, and finally his father lost patience and pulled the plug in the wall, and his son shot him. That's how angry he got. So, without wanting to be too pessimistic, it's a worry. I think it is up to us to learn how to handle this stuff. We've created a bit of a monster, I think.
We certainly need to set the example.
We do.
Dr. Nadia, our time is up, and it's I'm bearing in mind it's a school night.
Yes.
So I want to say thank you to Dr. Nadia for your time, for your patience in giving us this talk and answering our questions, and to all of you for attending. As I mentioned, this talk has been recorded. It will be it will be edited and then posted on the Pokrov YouTube channel. I'll pass on the link to the YouTube channel and this video on our Facebook page once it's available, and we will conclude with prayer.
Thank you very much.
Is truly meet to blessed the Theotokos, ever blessed and most blameless, and Mother of our God, more honourable than the cherubim, beyond compare, more glorious than the seraphim, without corruption there is better to God the word, the very fields of us, thee do we magnify. Thank you, Dr. Alia.
Thank you.
everybody.
Thank you.
And we hope to see you all soon, and I will let you know when the next Faith and Wisdom Family Talk is happening. We just have to line up the speakers. Have a good night, everybody. God bless.
Good night. God bless.